We're going to take a look at some African American art, which does begin with the African diaspora. And the first question I think we have to ask is, what is a diaspora? A diaspora occurs when people are scattered or dispersed. It derives from a Greek word that literally means dispersion, and it is first applied to the Jews in the 19th century, at least commonly applied. There are two types of diasporas. One is by force and the other is by need. The one that would be by force would apply in particular to the Jews and to the Africans, both peoples who were moved out of their homeland forcibly. There's also diaspora by necessity, and that would be individuals seeking a better life, or perhaps forced to seek a better life. And probably I am at least half Irish, probably some of you are as well. It would apply in particular, think of the Irish and think of the potato famine. Both of these would qualify as diasporas. The diaspora dealing directly with the slave trade and with Africans that are forcibly removed from the continent begins in the 9th century. And it begins with the Arabs who begin collecting slaves. They take them to the western portions of Asia where they can be sold. In particular, I'm thinking about the Arabian Peninsula right now. The reason for this is that Muslims cannot be enslaved. So if you want slaves to serve at court or to work in some of your industries or some of your jobs, you're going to need to locate non-Muslims. And Africa was a good source for this. By the 15th century, the slave trade is going to expand. The Portuguese will initially become important players in the slave trade, and then other Europeans are going to become involved in this. And it is going to grow, particularly the Atlantic slave trade, and that's the slave trade that serves the United States. If you take a look at Mr. O'Reilly, he estimates that there are about 12 million Africans sent to the United States alone, and that's before the end of the slave trade. Okay, legally, the U.S. government will end the slave trade in 1808. Maybe I should have used the word technically, because slaves continued to be smuggled into the United States long after that period in time. The photos that we're looking at right now are just to kind of help remind you of the points I'm trying to introduce. The man in the photos, his name is Salah. I met him in Oman. He was my guide. I went to Oman fairly recently, and when I arrived and met my guide, I was surprised to see, at least initially, that he was clearly of African descent, and he was not an indigenous native Arab from the region. And he was the one who first introduced me to the strong history of slave trading in Oman, and also in the eastern, in particular the eastern coast, but throughout the Arabian Peninsula, and would be representative of the long history of slave trading. The slaves did bring to the new home, whatever the home was, skills and beliefs, and we do have ship manifests that record their professions. It lists if they had skills as an artisan, for example, if they could work as a carpenter, if they could produce pottery, if they could sew, etc., etc. The value of the slave was increased if the slave had a skill. Particularly, I'm thinking carpenters and blacksmiths, but maybe also weavers and potters, maybe a little less so. Then on the plantations as well, training was increased for the slave once they arrived, because that in turn increased the value of the slave if you turn around and you sell the slave again. Mr. O'Reilly mentions, in fact, Booker T. Washington, who claimed that the plantation system actually functioned as our first, in the United States, our first technical schools. I don't think he was intending that as a compliment. What this does mean is that we have very limited evidence of true slave art during this period of acculturation in the United States. The slaves are brought here. They are quickly converted to the extent possible to Christianity, and they're going to be forced to produce Western goods for their slave masters. Anything that was associated with their heritage, which could be a threat to the white owner or the white society, was banned or was actually destroyed. So, for example, there would be no drums that would have been made by the slaves once they were on the plantation. Why? Because the drums could be used for purposes of communication and to incite the slave population. Consequently, very little has survived. The materials out of which slaves made their art, and I am assuming that there is a lot of art made by slaves that has not lasted because it was made of perishable materials. These materials, these objects also would not at the time have been particularly valuable. What we are looking and we do believe is the oldest African American object to survive is an Akan drum, and that comes from the region of Ghana in the west coast of Africa, and today it resides in the British Museum. Okay, it was not made on the plantation, but it was probably transported on a slave ship to the New World and ultimately back to England. Let me explain the backstory on this. The object, which we believe was made in the 18th century, was produced using at least two types of African wood, and we can document this through testing. One of those is a hardwood that was very famous for its resonance, and therefore it would be appropriate to use for a drum. The material on the top of this, however, is deerskin, and that comes from the New World, and again, this can be tested scientifically. It's been stretched and held into position with vegetable fiber, which I'm also assuming is coming from the New World. When slaves went on slave ships, they had absolutely nothing of their own. They weren't allowed to take their own possessions. So we think that this drum was brought on a ship by a member of the crew, and it's been suggested that it might be the son, perhaps, of the chief who sold the slaves to the captain of the ship, who would then carry them to their destination. The drum would have served a purpose in the transit of the slaves across the Atlantic, because there would be a point at which the slaves would be brought from the hold below up to the top of the ship, and the slaves would be danced. Okay, what does that mean? It means that they would be exercised to the beat of the drum. The drum then became acquired by a reverend, a collector, who was interested in ethnographic objects from Africa, but particularly objects that related to slave music, and he's made some notes and left some documentation. So we do have some knowledge of music and its origins coming out of Africa and in the early period of the diaspora. He's going to donate his collection. Ultimately, it will end up in the British Museum, where it was listed as one of 100 objects important for the history of the world. Why would that be? Because it does link Africa, the New World, and that would be the United States most likely, and the British Empire together through this single object. We think that back in Africa it would have been used probably in a chief's orchestra. Music was a very, very important part of court activities, and also music was an important part of African life in general. Before I leave this slide, I do want you to see our drum rather, is located on the left, 18th century, from the west coast. There are other images of modern drums coming from the same region, two of them top right, and I think you can see that the formula has continued, and the traditions of drum design in this region have continued. The one at the bottom on the right is an image that I, again, borrowed from eBay. These are drums that are for sale today, and I guess by now you're used to the fact that I kind of like to do this to suggest that a lot of traditions, global traditions, have continued and perhaps been modernized, but definitely have continued. Okay, this is a much closer look at our drums so you can get perhaps an appreciation for the craftsmanship, the symmetry of the design, and the engraved work on the wood. I am going to count it as a work of art. I do think it has a kind of harmony to the composition, but it is a drum, so I leave that decision up to you. I would like to make the argument that some of the traditional beliefs and aesthetics coming out of Africa did survive. I'm a very strong believer in continuation of traditions anyway. I also think it's very difficult to strip a people of their underlying beliefs. I can give you a little bit of an indication that this might be true, but again, we're lacking in examples that were made of materials that were long-lasting. I would also like to remind you that the U.S. Creates an act that prohibits the import of slaves. It goes into effect in 1808. It was a legislation that was actually promoted by Thomas Jefferson, and it was intended to abolish the international slave trade. You could still, of course, breed slaves and sell slaves within the United States. The thing that I would like to point out, however, is that my guess is, and we have some indication in records, that there were slaves still being illegally imported or smuggling into the United States and to other places as well after 1808. I have one number up to 50,000 illegally imported coming through Texas and also through the region of Florida. Those were two areas that had not yet become states in the Union when it made it possible for them to take slaves in and then allowed those slaves to cross the border. The South Carolina governor also in 1819 gives us an estimate that there were over 13,000 slaves smuggled in every year. So my point here is that we're still getting Africans coming pretty much directly out of Africa. Consequently, they're infusing those who are already here or re-infusing them with a continuation of beliefs and ideas. And we do have a window about 1850, 1860-ish, or perhaps going up to 1870, when we have some pottery shops creating face jugs made in plantations. And excuse me, in South Carolina in particular, these objects, of course, are sturdy, they can survive, and so we have them as documentation of, I'm going to make the point, continuation of traditions. You're going to have to check me and see if you agree with that. These objects, I would like to argue, are a continuation of African sources and ideas, in particular with the emphasis on the face. These are jugs. This one is from, actually two views, from Mr. O'Reilly. They were created and they were originally used as water jugs, and they are decorated with white kaolin. Let me take another look here at the next slide because I think the kaolin's easier to see there. There you go. Okay, the kaolin white slip was used for the teeth and for the eyes. We've already seen that on the continent of Africa. I think that it's carried over here. In Africa, on the continent, it was associated, the white kaolin was associated with the spirit realm and with death also. I believe, personally, that that carried over to the face jugs. Some of these have been broken and thrown into graves. Consequently, I would like to also link their use, and that would include in death, with the other world and with the realm of the spirits. We also have been told, I don't know if it's true, but we've been told that they were used to bring protection, to function kind of as an amulet or protective device for runaways, and that they were found in a number of areas in the South, probably as runaways were carrying them. That I can't document, but it makes perfect sense in terms of the sources that they could have been drawn from. Let me give you another. Okay, these are additional examples. The one I just showed you a moment ago is one of many that are in the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection. The Philly Museum began to acquire these around 1890, so sometime at the end of the 19th century. We have a lot of these, and I think that they are a useful tool for documenting continuation of traditions. The objects were used for storing water. They're stoneware, they're ceramics that were glazed, they're earthenware, and they, I would argue, maintain strong elements of African design. The potters who made these were slaves. They used a potter's wheel to create the shape of the jug, and then they used hand modeling, hand shaping, to actually create the face that you're taking a look at on these. The really cool thing about some of these is that they're signed, and I do know that slave owners attempted to ensure that slaves did not learn to write, but pretty clearly some of the slaves did. There's one slave named Dave who put rhyming couplets on these, and the sample that I was able to find to show you is another one of these face jugs, and this is the back of it. And you can see, we don't really, it's not easy to read, and we aren't really sure if it's the name of the maker or perhaps the name of the maker's child. But we do know that there's a signature on this. Okay. This is what I'd like to suggest would function as a source, or sources perhaps is better, coming from the continent of Africa. That's another face jug, and I want you to see the kaolin on the eyes, on the teeth. The figures across the bottom are power figures. They are figures, yes, in Central Africa, but I think they would have been understood throughout the continent. Kaolin on the eyes to function in the spirit world, and also, if visible, the teeth, I believe, are also whitened. These are figures to help protect, to ensure justice, and they are sometimes figures that go after evildoers. The figure upper left is a piece that comes from the Ikoi people in southeastern Nigeria. It was associated with one of the secret societies there, and I simply draw your attention to the teeth and to the eyes. Exactly how these objects were used by the slaves, we may never know with certainty, but I am pretty comfortable saying that they can be linked to original African on the continent, African traditions, and that they help to document continuation of values, beliefs, and perhaps aesthetics as well.